The American tank crews first heard rumors about the new German machine long before they ever saw one. Soldiers returning from the Eastern Front described it as a metal beast, something huge, silent, and deadly from miles away. They called it the Ferdinand, a tank destroyer so heavily armored that even a direct hit from standard Allied rounds simply bounced off like pebbles against a fortress wall. When U.S. forces moved deeper into Italy in 1943, they were not expecting to meet one. Most believed the Germans had deployed only a handful, and mainly on the Russian front. But the battlefield had a way of bringing surprises. One morning, as American Sherman crews advanced through a valley shrouded in smoke, they noticed strange impact marks on destroyed friendly vehicles ahead. The hits were clean, precise, and fired from extreme distance, far beyond what any Panzer or anti-tank gun could manage. That was the first sign the rumors were true. Ferdinand tank destroyers carried a massive 88mm PaK-43 gun, a weapon so accurate and powerful that it could destroy a Sherman before the Americans even knew where the shot came from. Survivors recalled hearing only a sharp crack in the distance, followed by the sound of metal tearing open like paper. The crews inside rarely had a chance to escape. Reports spread quickly. "Something big is hunting us." American commanders warned their men not to engage it head-on. The Ferdinand had up to 200mm of frontal armor, more than twice what their Shermans could penetrate. Sherman crews began moving more cautiously, sticking to covered terrain and watching the ridgelines. They knew the German gunners preferred long distances, where the Ferdinand was practically untouchable. One afternoon, a U.S. reconnaissance unit spotted a silhouette on a ridge, massive, square-sided, almost motionless. At first, they thought it was a bunker. Only when the sun briefly pierced through the smoke did they see it. The long barrel, the sloped armor, and the huge tracks. The monster was real. The Germans fired first. A single round tore through the lead Sherman from over a mile away. The tank didn't explode. It simply stopped moving, smoke pouring from its seams as the crew scrambled out. The Americans answered with everything they had, but their shells did nothing more than spark off the Ferdinand's thick frontal plate. It was like throwing stones at a steel wall. The only way to stop it was to outmaneuver it. American crews spread out, trying to flank the beast, knowing that its sides and rear were its only vulnerable points. But the Ferdinand's position was too strong, its field of fire too wide. With each shot, it disabled another vehicle. Only when Allied artillery began saturating the ridge did the Germans retreat, the giant machine disappearing into the smoke from which it had first emerged. The Americans didn't destroy it that day, but they finally understood what they were facing. The Ferdinand wasn't just another enemy vehicle. It was a monster on the battlefield, a machine built to dominate any open ground and strike fear into every tanker who saw it. When American tankers finally found a destroyed Ferdinand on the battlefield, it felt almost unreal. For months, the machine had been a phantom, striking from long distances, vanishing into smoke, and leaving wrecked Shermans behind. To the men who faced it, the Ferdinand was not just a weapon. It was a legend, a terrifying giant of steel. But legends, even the most powerful ones, eventually meet their end. It happened after days of heavy fighting, when the front line shifted and the U.S. infantry advanced through a stretch of forest scarred by artillery. The trees were splintered, the earth torn open, and the smell of burned oil still hung in the air. As the soldiers moved forward, a massive silhouette appeared between the smoking trunks. At first, they thought it was a bunker, a concrete fortification left behind by retreating German forces. But as they approached, they saw the thick sloped armor, the massive wheels, and the long barrel partially buried in the ground. Ferdinand, and it was dead. The closer the Americans got, the more the story revealed itself. The giant hadn't been destroyed by tank fire. No Sherman could have penetrated its frontal armor. Instead, they found deep tracks in the mud where the machine had struggled to move. The terrain here was soft, uneven, and unforgiving. The Ferdinand, heavy and mechanically fragile, had tried to cross a small ravine and failed. The earth under its massive weight had collapsed. The vehicle's suspension twisted. One of the drive wheels had cracked. Its engine, already notorious for overheating, had seized after hours of strained effort. The crew likely abandoned it during the night, leaving behind empty shell casings, ration tins, and a logbook filled with hurried notes. This fearsome giant had not been brought down by enemy fire. It had fallen to its own weight. American tankers approached carefully. Even crippled, the Ferdinand looked dangerous. Its armor was blackened, scarred from artillery fragments. The interior smelled of oil, metal, and desperation. But what caught everyone's attention was the front plate. Untouched, smooth, almost defiant. It reminded them why their own tanks had suffered so heavily in earlier encounters. But then they noticed something else, something that explained its downfall even more clearly. No machine gun, no defensive weapon for close-range protection. The Ferdinand had been designed to kill tanks from miles away, not survive infantry attacks. Once immobilized, it was helpless. American troops found abandoned Panzerfausts nearby and traces of explosives. German engineers had tried to blow up the vehicle to prevent capture, but the demolition charge had misfired. The giant had simply been left behind, too heavy to move, too valuable to destroy, and too broken to be saved. The soldiers stood around the wreck, staring at the machine that had haunted so many units. Seeing it up close stripped away the myth. Yes, it had unmatched firepower. Yes, it could destroy their tanks long before they got into range. But in the end, it was a flawed masterpiece, powerful but slow, deadly but blind at short distances, impressive but unreliable. The giant had fallen not because the Americans were stronger, but because the machine had been built without balance. As the soldiers marked the wreck on their maps and prepared to move on, one of them said quietly, "It wasn't unbeatable. It was just big." And with that, the legend of the Ferdinand began to crumble, replaced by a clearer, more human truth. Even the mightiest war machines can fall not with a dramatic explosion, but with a quiet, mechanical failure in the mud of a forgotten battlefield. The morning sun had barely risen when the column of American Shermans rolled forward across the muddy French field. The air was still, almost unnaturally quiet, except for the steady rumble of engines and the metallic clatter inside the tanks. Dust floated behind the formation like a long tail. Lieutenant Harris, commander of the lead Sherman, wiped the fog from his periscope and narrowed his eyes. A thin layer of smoke drifted from the treeline ahead. Too still, too controlled to be random. "Something's burning out there," he radioed. His gunner, Peters, replied, "Probably another farm hit last night, or something worse." As they pushed closer, the smell reached them: oil, steel, and a faint hint of burnt rubber. Every tanker recognized that scent. It was the smell of a tank that had died hard. "Slow it down," Harris ordered. The Shermans crawled forward, engines grumbling as they climbed a small rise. And then they saw it. Lying half-turned in the shallow ditch was a massive German Tiger tank. Its thick armor was scarred with shrapnel marks, and the turret was locked at an odd angle, as if frozen mid-turn. The once fearsome machine now sat silent, the black smoke rising from the engine deck like a fading memory. "Jesus," Peters whispered. "Look at the size of that thing." Even after months of fighting, a destroyed Tiger was still a rare sight for American crews. The enemy called it the Königstiger, the King Tiger, and for good reason. Most Shermans never survived long enough to get this close. Harris opened the hatch and stood up, feeling the cold morning air against his face. "Keep the guns ready. A wreck like this, it can hide surprises." The platoon formed a half-circle around the Tiger. Birds scattered from the trees as the engines idled. For a moment, no one spoke. The wreck radiated a strange kind of tension, as if the machine still held the ghost of the battle it had fought. Corporal Lewis's tank stopped beside the ditch. He leaned out with his binoculars, Tracks are blown clean off. Looks like mines did the job. Or the crew panicked, Harris muttered. Tigers are tough, but they break down more than people think. The Americans climbed down cautiously. The ground around the Tiger was churned up with deep tread marks, as if the tank had tried desperately to turn away. Its hatches were open, hanging crookedly. Peters pointed to a hole on the lower armor plate. That shot came from close range. Somebody got brave. They approached the hull. Inside, it was dark, silent, and still. A few personal items remained: a dented canteen, a burned map, a half-melted headset. The crew had abandoned the tank in a hurry. No bodies, no blood, just the smell of burned electronics and the heavy silence of defeat. Lewis exhaled slowly. Hard to believe something this big can fall apart like that. Harris nodded. Every machine has a weak point, even the German ones. For a moment the men simply stood there, absorbing the scene. One destroyed giant surrounded by the rumble of their own tanks. The Tiger was a reminder of how close any of them were to meeting the same fate. "Mount up," Harris finally said. His voice was calm, but the weight of the moment hung in the air. "We still have a job to do." The Shermans roared back to life. As they continued their advance, the wrecked Tiger remained behind them, smoke rising quietly into the morning sky, a silent monument to the brutality of the battlefield and the thin line between hunter and hunted. The Sherman tank crawled to a stop on the edge of the abandoned French village. The morning fog clung to the narrow streets, softening the outlines of broken walls and collapsed roofs. Lieutenant Harris lifted his headset slightly, listening. Nothing, no engines, no footsteps, no voices. The silence felt unnatural. "Clear so far," Peters said from the gunner's seat. Though his voice carried a nervous edge, they were following tracks, wide, deep, unmistakably German. A heavy tank had passed through recently, too heavy to be a Panther. And the tracks ended somewhere in this ruined village. "Move forward," Harris ordered. The Sherman crept between two shattered buildings. The fog thinned, and suddenly the silhouette appeared ahead. A German Tiger tank. It sat near the village fountain, turret frozen, engine silent. "Another wreck?" Lewis asked from the second tank behind them. "Hold position," Harris radioed. "Something's off." They approached slowly. The Tiger looked intact. No blast marks, no smoke, no obvious hits, just abandoned. That alone was unusual. Tiger crews rarely left their machines unless something had gone very wrong. Harris climbed out of the hatch and stood on the Sherman's turret. "Cover me. I'm going down." Peters groaned. "Sir, you're kidding." "Do it." With his Thompson ready, Harris approached the German tank. The ground around it showed signs of panic. Boots prints scattered in different directions, a dropped tool kit, even a helmet lying on its side. He climbed onto the hull. The steel was cold, damp from the fog. He stepped toward the front glassy plate, then he froze. Something was missing. "Lewis," Harris called. "Take a look at this." The second Sherman's commander jogged over and stared. His jaw tightened. The Tiger's bow machine gun mount, the iconic, ball-shaped MG port, was empty. The weapon had been completely removed. "No way," Lewis whispered. "Why would they strip it?" Peters leaned out of the Sherman hatch, squinting. "A Tiger without a bow MG? That's suicide." Harris inspected the mount more closely. The bolts were unscrewed by hand, not blasted out. This wasn't battle damage, this was intentional. "They took it themselves," Harris said. "Or someone took it from them." He climbed toward the turret. The hatch was open. Inside, the scene became even stranger. The ammunition racks were half full. The radio was intact. The driver's seat showed no signs of injury, no blood. The tank hadn't been knocked out. It had simply stopped. And yet the missing machine gun nagged at him. "Maybe the gun jammed?" Lewis offered. "Then it would still be here," Harris answered. Nobody removes a jammed MG under fire. The fog thickened again, sliding around the tank like a ghost. Harris felt unease creep into his chest. Something here didn't add up. He checked the engine compartment. The back plate was unlatched. Oil streaks dripped along the armor. A faint smell of overheating lingered. The engine cooked itself, Harris said. A breakdown. Classic Tiger problem. So they bailed because the tank died? Maybe. But why take the bow machine gun? The men exchanged glances. The only reason a crew would dismantle their MG was if they expected to continue fighting on foot. Harris stepped back from the tank, scanning the empty streets. They're out there somewhere, he muttered. Armed. Desperate. For the first time that morning, the village didn't feel empty. It felt watched. He raised his radio. All crews stay sharp. This Tiger isn't the real danger. The real danger was the crew, now infantry, armed with the missing machine gun, and likely hiding in the fog. When the sun finally broke through the clouds over the Italian hillside, its light fell on the burned-out shell of the Elephant tank destroyer. The massive machine sat half-buried in the mud, its thick armor split open by an explosion that must have lit up the valley the night before. The American tank crew approached cautiously, stepping through the churned earth left behind by the retreating Germans. Corporal Mason stopped first, running his hand over the Elephant's ruined superstructure. Hard to believe something this big could die like that, he muttered. Sergeant Doyle nodded. Size doesn't win battles. Decisions do. They circled the wreck. The Elephant still looked intimidating even in death. 70 tons of armor, a long 88mm gun capable of killing a Sherman at 2 miles, and frontal plating so thick a standard American shell might as well have been thrown by hand. On paper, it was terrifying. On the battlefield, it had proven itself strangely fragile. Mason crouched beside the shattered rear plate. The explosion had come from behind, a weak point the Germans had never truly solved. Engine hit, he said. Probably caught fire. Crew bailed out. If they got the chance, Doyle replied, staring at the blackened escape hatch. The Americans had heard stories about the Elephant at Kursk, where dozens were lost. Not from enemy fire, but from mines, breakdowns, and infantry assaults. No machine gun. No close-range defense. Once Soviet troops got near, the mighty tank destroyer became a steel coffin. Doyle stepped into the crew compartment, waving away the smoke-soaked smell. Inside, the equipment was scorched, wires melted into the walls. But the layout was still visible. Driver to the left, radio operator to the right, gunners and loaders packed behind them. A cramped, blind, vulnerable interior. You can't see anything out of this thing, Mason said from outside. They built a monster that couldn't even watch its own flanks. That's the problem, Doyle said. It was designed for perfect conditions. Flat ground, long range, no surprises. War doesn't work like that. He climbed back out and wiped his hands on his trousers. The Elephant had all the qualities of a fortress, immense firepower, nearly impenetrable armor, but none of the flexibility needed to survive the chaos of real combat. Every lesson was carved into the wreckage. First mistake, Doyle said. No machine gun. Infantry gets close, and it's over. Second mistake, Mason added, kicking the track. Too heavy. It breaks its own parts before the enemy even touches it. Third mistake, no mobility. If anything goes wrong, you can't maneuver, can't escape. They stood in silence for a moment, listening to distant artillery thundering beyond the hills. The Elephant's massive guns still pointed toward the countryside, useless and silent. Still, Mason said quietly, I think about the crew. Imagine being in this thing. Engine goes out. Smoke fills the cabin. You can't turn the turret. You can't defend the rear. You know infantry are coming. And the only way out is through a tiny hatch, Doyle finished. Yeah, that's a bad way to go. The sergeant took one last slow walk around the vehicle. The Germans thought armor and firepower were everything, he said. Build it bigger, thicker, stronger. But all that weight becomes a prison if the machine can't adapt. He tapped the armored side with his knuckles. This is what happens when a battlefield teaches you something your engineers ignored. Mason looked out toward the valley. So what's the lesson for us? Doyle answered without hesitation. Mobility, reliability, situational awareness. A tank isn't just a gun on wheels. It has to survive what commanders didn't plan for. A gust of wind blew ashes across the ground. The elephant loomed in the sunlight, giant, powerful, and utterly defeated. A monster, Doyle said softly, but one that forgot how to live.